but from last week, we're going to cover about the topics that some of the concepts that we walked through. And the first point there on how was it like to experience the class last week?
So what we came up with is that trauma is a systemic issue, and there is an individual. This is the credits are for Google. They made the image available. So you have the individual psychological structure, but you also have like these things sustaining the I as what's the bigger landscape, the collective structures, cultures, societal boundaries and norms. And then we talked about intra, and socio-political phenomenon. This was recapped before. But there is also this not only psychological structure, but the previous experiences, personal history, ancestral, the trauma is ancestral. Like we've studied like people from who are descendants of Holocaust survivors, for example. And then the trauma is imprinted on the DNA. And there is the history as well. And then there are the external levers, that we talked about. So culture as a very big aspect of how trauma occurs, and also people's threshold for trauma is determined by culture, highly influenced by culture. And another level as well is the violence that the individual or the group or the community is subject to. So political, economical, societal violence, structural violence, and that influences how the trauma is suffered and also how the trauma is perceived and how the trauma is processed after all, because the traumatic event becomes both a scar and a filter. On the scar that in the sense that it's imprinted on the individual psychological structure and body. We haven't touched upon the body yet, and I'm very curious about that, but it is felt on the body, but it's also a filter because how the individual responds and reacts and assess the world is filtered through the traumatic experience. So with that, another concept we touched upon is, what is trauma? So we talked about trauma as a single event, and trauma type 2 as a repetitive or an early event in childhood. And then the typology was sexual, physical, emotional, and I'm sure we can expand this typology if we detail or go to other authors. And we talked about triggers. So, if people have been subjected to like a natural caused disaster and is traumatized by that event by listening, or being on a war zone by listening to a thunder that reminds the person of a bomb, and that can be a trigger, or even popcorn. Or people who have been subjected to an abusive father, has a abusive boss, and that becomes a trigger as well. And then what we were trying to, Rawad and I, to kind of distill steps on how to work with people and communities traumatized. And then we went back to what has happened in class so far. And what we learned is that we went through kind of this wheel that we spent quite a lot of time taking stock of where we are. So our definitions of self-boundaries, self-beliefs, narratives. And then we went into collective sense making that we shared in small groups and shared in a larger group of how, like, those experiences of who we are and our boundaries. And then we finished week 2 by having a homework that was addressing the trauma or addressing the self through art. And then that homework ends on reimagining that reality, because the last thing is, how would you draw yourself having gone through this differently, or redraw yourself? So the reimagination of the reality seems to be the outcome of going through the trauma. And then we are, I'll let you, Rawad, why don't you jump in? Because I think you also added beautiful things there.
I added a few things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted, I thought some of because we had a lot of prompt questions as well. And I think Ashok was asking us to focus on the appropriate demands and expectations that we make of ourselves, and the inappropriate ones as maybe questions we should consider for exploring. And I put the keywords in the white space as kind of I threw them around there, but they're kind of the ingredients of working through.
Oops, sorry. I'll go back there.
Yeah, working through some so we need time. We need maybe be able to talk to a therapy professional. We need a support group, a community group, a safe space, and an opportunity to grieve and sort of extend out of. So we're not acting out from the place that we got hurt and how we coped with it. And allowing, maybe that's recognizing that these might be the ingredients that other people need, that we work with. And the last slide was, I made a couple of documents and I put the links there. So we'll share those links. And one is, how do we tackle all of the reading that we have? Because the reading is really important. And I think there's an opportunity here that we can work together, at least to dig into it. Maybe not one person has the time to read everything before the course is over, but we maybe have some time to read some part of it. And so I wanted to invite you to make notes, not necessarily read the thing if you want, but like if you choose a section, like 5 pages from one of the books or something, one of the articles, and make notes of what you find interesting in here, what the kind of keywords that you see or the theme that this is exploring. And then we can populate a sort of a shorthand reference for that we would like populate from ourselves, like all of us. And now, so we'll have like a pager where we can look up the thing that's referenced and say like, oh yeah, it's in this book somewhere in page 73 to 89 or something. Then I can focus there if I don't have the time to do this on my own. And the second sheet is the tools cheat sheets. So we've covered a bunch. Some of them are about creative expression, about the utility for journaling and moving the body, and using art and coloring and non-verbal mediums. And so we can make those notes and we can talk about when to use them and what's the intention behind them.
So thank you guys. Wonderful. I was listening to everything while I was drinking my tea and also looking at various dimensions you were bringing. And thanks for all these wonderful reflections. You've taken it extremely seriously and done this work and owned the process. In any class, it's always a joy to see people owning the process and the wonderful recap and everything. I'm going to move forward a little bit. I'm going to accelerate the engine a little bit more, moving from collective trauma and what we were looking at in the last class. By the end of today, we will know, we'll come to a little bit of diagnosis of trauma for answering the question, how do you know a person is actually traumatized or not? And then we will move into some activities tomorrow where we will be talking about symbols of trauma. What are these things that symbolize trauma and stuff like that? And in between, we will also go into a small breakout group. So here I am with my screen share. It's all clear. Now here, we want to start with what we call as family trauma. Families can be traumatized. When an individual is traumatized, we live in families, and obviously families can be traumatized a lot. And it affects us severely. And you cannot just run away from this because it's your kith and kin, it's your relative, it is your son, it is your wife or husband or whatever. So families can be traumatized. And this is what we are talking about in a world where we spoke about the micro and the meso. In the mesosphere, this happens. And when this happens in the microsphere, then it automatically moves into the mesosphere. And we talk about trauma as it happens in the family. There are a few ways in which trauma happens in family. So it has different effects. The first is simultaneous effects. Sorry for it being too wordy. The simultaneous effects are when a catastrophe directly strikes and the entire family is scattered. A natural disaster like what happened in Katrina, or what happened in Kerala, or what happened most recently in Uttarakhand just last week. We had a huge breakdown of the dam, or you can have something like an earthquake, like a tsunami, and things like that. Now, when all the family members get simultaneously affected, and for war, for example, the war in Syria, or displacement in Sri Lanka, or we can talk about the post-Arab Springs in Egypt. We can talk about any of these when the entire family is experiencing similar trauma. All of us are experiencing trauma. Some of us come out of it very resilient, some of us don't. Then what happens is there's the next part where we call it as vicarious effects. The vicarious effects are like nothing has happened to you, but out there, your family member is suffering and you just can't stay in touch with them. It can be in terms of a collapse of a tunnel or an accident or war, or suddenly there's a border closure. Like, for example, what happened over here when COVID struck. In 4 hours, they locked down the entire country, which according to me is an extremely stupid move. In India, we have these things like that, and everything comes to a standstill. We had this again in the demonetization. One night, the Prime Minister announces that from today onwards at 12 o'clock, no longer 500 notes and 1,000 rupee notes will no longer be legal tender. Everything came to a standstill. So during this COVID, what happened was the buses and trains stopped running on a midnight. Just given date, everything stopped. So there are family members who were traveling from one part of the country to the other. There was a man who had gone for a job. Most interesting part was a man who called me and said, "Sir, please arrange so that I can go back to Andhra Pradesh." I asked him, "What happened?" He said, "I came here for an assessment or an audit, but I'm stuck here. My wife and children are all in Andhra Pradesh. That's about 450 kilometers. I have no money. I've exhausted all my money. I don't have money even to recharge my phone. I'm not able to stay in touch with my wife and children." Now, what do you do in this case? So what I do is I reach out to the family. I reach out to the family, use my links, and I conference them on a call. And when I call the family, they speak in Telugu, and this man speaks to me in English. I don't speak that much of Telugu. Just try and understand and put them together. Now, you don't know what's going on, and that is traumatizing. Another interesting story is there were 9 men who came to India, and they were actually fishermen from Sri Lanka. They were stuck, and it so happened the boat, the fishing boat vessel just broke down, and all of them were in prison for 9 months. I get a call all of this sudden, just from the blue, out of the blue, and then I they ask me, they say that, "Okay, sir, there's somebody from Sri Lanka who wants to see you." And I go to the Jagat Singhpur prison, and these guys are there, Sinhalese guys, who don't talk a single word of Tamil. I don't speak a single word of Sinhalese. I told them, I just asked them a few questions, but they spoke fluent Hindi. In the 9 months, they were able to speak in Hindi completely, learned Hindi. And they've not seen their families for 9 months. 2 days later, I go to Sri Lanka and meet all their families there. And one person's father has died, one person's wife has given birth, another person's mother has cancer, so on and so forth. And what happens is the family has not stayed in contact for 9 months with these people, and the entire community is almost mourning. Then we have the chiasmal effects. The chiasmal effects is when one person is traumatized, the entire family gets traumatized. Like a nightmare in the examples we have quoted over there is when this person starts narrating, a person comes back after being in a conflict or being in war, and he comes back and gives you this story. He narrates the entire story to you with great detail. And then the person is still with you at home. And after a few days, when you hear a small cracker or a bomb or a noise, a very loud thud, the entire family is shuddering. So this is called chiasmal effects. And then we're also talking about intrafamilial trauma. Now, what is happening is intrafamilial trauma is something very, very, very serious. Now, this is also, as I referred to it in last class by Judith Herman, she talks about captivity. In a family, when there's ongoing violence, where the wife is not able to leave the home. Like today, somebody came and met me, an old friend of mine. I've not seen her in many years. She just came and she hugged me and said, I'm here and you need to help me. So I listened to the story and she told me that she's already married for about 12 years. And for the last 10 years out of that, every day she has been abused. So I asked her, you're an empowered woman. What made you to take, what took you so long to decide uh, differently? She's an empowered woman, she's educated, she has a job. But she says, I have two children, a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. I don't know what to do with them. These two boys won't have a father. I can't leave the father and just on. And the man is an activist. He's philosophically, ideologically very sound, knows about rights. And the worst part is he's a lawyer. So these are circumstances under which you are just struggling in this intrafamilial trauma. Now, with this, in this situation, you need to understand that collective trauma need not be only community based. It can be very, very family based. And so that takes us to the next set of questions. Now, family members listen to these stories over and over and over again. All family members keep listening to these stories. Sometimes, or most of the times rather, repeating a story to strangers can be healing. But listening to the same story by people who really love you can be haunting and hurting. So that can be very difficult. So these are 5 questions. Please take down these questions. I will also share these questions on the chat box in a moment. These are questions that we will be repeatedly asking during the course of healing as well. Now, remember, I was telling you about the rational emotive therapy in the last class, or reality orientation therapy in the last class. Here, we are talking about a reality check. A rational emotive therapy comes very handy to deal with it. So in your toolbox, you should add these 5 questions. The what happened question, why did it happen? Why did I and others act as we did then? Why did I and others act as we did since then? If something like this happened again, would I be able to cope more effectively? So 5 very, very crucial questions, different kinds of questions. So the first question is a simple narrative question, which means it also gives you a narrative answer. What happened? So breaking down to various pieces. I told you the difference or the link between analytical and systemic understanding. The first part is more an analytical understanding. It just takes it part by part. You go into this. So there are 2 tools in this where you can use another tool. It's called a trauma timeline. A trauma timeline. What is a trauma timeline? A trauma timeline is, when did the incident happen? Who was involved in the incident? And when did people see you? When was the first time that you actually felt that this was having an impact on you? So then you just keep marking it by days. Sometimes you break it down to hours. Okay, break it down to hours. And when you're breaking it to hours, what happens to you is you start dealing with it more intensely, and then you have a clear timeline, a trauma timeline. Now, in addition to that, you also have what is known as a traumaogram. A traumaogram. A traumaogram is just like a sociogram, where you're talking about using boxes, you can use triangles, you can use circles, and you draw the entire picture, and they say, who is involved in this picture? a traumaogram and a trauma line or a trauma timeline. That's what we use. So this gives you a large picture of how you need to deal with this issue. So then you ask this question. Many times when you are traumatized, often the first reaction or response is denial. It cannot happen to me. I'm not traumatized. There's nothing wrong with me. Why are you asking me these questions? For that question, you pose a question like this, asking, why did it happen? What are the reasons? Maybe it's just in the wrong place in the wrong time, or this has been happening for over a period of time repeatedly, or it is just happening where you just don't know. Many children who have been abused really don't know why it happened to them. Maybe it's a child. Survivors of the Holocaust tell us why it happened. But this is only post-trauma, not during trauma. It's post-trauma. People try and understand why it happened. And there are many reasons that you can't even find out why it happened to you. For example, you are going in a bus and two men just accost you and take you away and they put you in prison. They just put you in prison. There's no reason, no questions asked. A number of times this has happened in Israel and Palestine conflict. People just being taken, abducted, or taken for inquiry, investigation, and stuff like that. There's just no answer. Why? But then you try to make meaning out of it. Why did it happen? Or probably that you will not get the immediate micro level answers, but you will get meso, exo, and macro level answers. Those answers are very important because the place where it happens, that's the exo that happens, the intervention that takes place somewhere over there. When that happens, you have to reconnect it with the meaning of life. That's reconnection. Then, why did I and others act as we did then? What was my instant reaction? How did I react? Why did I react over there? Now, one of the key answers that you get is first is safety, second is helplessness. Why did you succumb to that man? This guy was trying to abuse you. And why did you give in to that abuse? It's helplessness. At that point, you don't know what to do. Second, you tolerated it because you wanted to save your life. Nothing else, just to save your life. That's something. But then you have so many other answers to it. There are so many other questions to it. You can continue with these questions a lot more. And then, why did I and others act as we did since then? Till now, why am I reacting to something? It's not happening here, right? It's not happening now. It happened a long time ago.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I couldn't understand how a boost can give a safety to a woman.
Can you please repeat that question?
How you said that abuse or any kind of trauma can give a person helplessness and the safety, right? So how
No.
an abuse can give a person safety?
No. Why did the person allow you to be abused? Why are you allowing somebody to be abused? To that question, why did it happen? To that question, otherwise the person will kill you. He threatens to kill you. So you allow yourself to be abused. You permit the abuse because of this is the lesser evil than the other. That's safety. You say that, of course, it is not safe to allow you, otherwise the person is going to kill you. Like, for example, I'll tell you this grueling story that we have been dealing with in the last few days. We have been dealing with some really terrible things and have been working on trauma. The last week has been quite harrowing for us. In a community where we work, there are two children, a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old. Both of them have been repeatedly raped by a 60-year-old man. 60-year-old, okay? This is unimaginable. So, to cut the long story short, one of the counselors who was present in the session asked one girl, "Why didn't you shout and run away from the place?" Now, she just lifted her hand. She lifted her hand like this and showed an injury that was this big. Her entire elbow was hurt. So the counselor asked the child, "What happened?" She said, "Once I refused, and this man, he took a big stone and smashed my hand and it injured me. So I did not know what to do. So this was the lesser evil." That's how, so then because you want to protect yourself, you just succumb to it. That's what is very important when it's captivity. When you are in a situation of captivity, considering all other things, this is only looked as an alternative. So in no way this is justifiable. It cannot be justified. An abuse is an abuse. So given that circumstance, you seek safety and you prefer, it's not preference, you don't have a choice but to remain abused. For example, abandonment. The father threatens the children and the family, a poor family that is completely uneducated, no income, no home to stay, basically staying in a shack. The father is abusing the daughter. And the father says he will leave you if you report this to anybody else. The father will be taken away and you will not have anything to eat. Because of the fear of abandonment, the mother has no say in this. And these are real things that happened. So therefore, what we try and do is we need to find ways to rescue them, to find ways to move away from them. This is where the society plays an important role. I'll tell you more about the case in a bit. But then what we want to ask is these questions are very important. Now, why did I and others act since then? It's repetitive. Now, trauma is like a record that has been broken and it's constantly playing. It's a scratched record and it goes around playing in your head the same way, and you are behaving as if the trauma is happening right now. Typical PSTD. There are people who think that the paranoia is not over. The paranoia still exists. People are here to murder me, they're coming to take me, they're going to kill me, and various other things. And if you listen to some of the stories of the young women who were taken away by Boko Haram about 5 years ago, the stories of those women have been well documented. Some of them have been rescued. And they tell us that there's just no choice. And every time we are alone, we are really scared. Alone means even for a few minutes, they cannot remain alone. They think it's going to happen again. The environment has changed, everything has changed, but not. Now, the last question is, if something like this happened again, would I be able to cope more effectively? This is after understanding trauma. Let's move on with that, and I have some questions over here. We have a question which says, what if somebody is just annoying and people are, it's just, is how traumatizing is that? Or we're also talking about people coming back to you and asking, feeling very uncomfortable. Is that traumatizing? Or you're also asking the discomfort, anger, and upsetness, and things like that. Now, all this cannot be categorized as trauma. And thank you for leading me into the next part, where we are talking a lot about, we will be talking about some of the diagnostic tools, where how do you know that you're traumatized, even if you are in a community, even if you're listening to collective trauma, there are certain parameters by which you know somebody is traumatized. And also, there are ways you can find out about the psychosomatic effect of trauma. The somatic effect means the body. Many times, when you are subjected to trauma, it manifests in your body. One of the first symptoms that you get in the body is skin symptoms. You have boils, you get strange skin reactions. Another symptom that you get is blisters in your mouth because the stomach is the one that reacts. The stomach churns. And there's a lot of literature available which suggests that the mind body connect. The mind body connect is if you've had a very tense day or when you had such a difficult experience, you have you suffer from indigestion. That's one part. Apart from indigestion, you develop mouth ulcers. Then after you have mouth ulcers, you have fatigue. And then you have no desire for food. There's no appetite. Over there are two parts. One is no desire for food. The second is you just want to hog and hog and hog. You want to just eat and eat and eat. It's a very typical sign, a symbol of depression. So all these things are very normal, but when it happens excessively, that's when you should know there's something wrong with you. And pains, where does trauma accumulate? The trauma accumulates in the shoulder. And why does trauma accumulate in the shoulder here, especially back? Is because of your breathing. Your breathing is not regulated. If your breathing is regulated, then that part gets healed a little bit. And it's sore. It is sore over there. Any muscle can react to trauma. So there is a lot of bodily manifestation of trauma. Now, things like not being able to move, or things like phantom pains, like loss of a limb. When somebody loses a limb or has amputated his arm, what happens to you is you feel that the arm is still there and its arm is still paining. That's called a phantom pain. And the phantom pain exists even emotionally. Even after the trauma is gone, you dealt with it, there are also phantom traumas that you think that the situation still exists and you're reimagining the situation. They're no longer there. So like that, there are phantom experiences. But then there are certain indicators of how you understand trauma actually works or does not work. I actually wanted to plan this group session to discuss these questions, but I thought I will continue with these the inputs and then come to the questions for discussion. Is that okay, people? Okay, great. Let's proceed with this. So let me just share the screen. Now here, tools for diagnosis. The first part is if you want to know a person, if you are traumatized or if somebody else is traumatized, there must be a direct exposure to any of these. You have been exposed to actual death, threatened by death, serious injury, or sexual violence, though to one of the following. It's just one, any one. It can be direct experience or exposure, witnessing events in person, indirect exposure, learning about these events happening to a close relative or friend. If exposure involves death, it must be a violent or accidental death. Repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events as part of your line of work. Every day you're seeing this. You are a firefighter or you are a police officer or you are working in an extremely stressful environment or you're from the media and stuff like that. Now, any one of these are enough to first have you as a trigger. These are triggers, and triggers can be just one time or many times. Then you probably should look at this more intensely because here we are seeing a number of interesting facts. Over here we are saying that one or more, this is, you could have any one or more. Do you have recurrent, involuntary, intrusive, and distressing memories in children possibly expressed through play? Now, I'll give you a very interesting example. We're working with child soldiers in Sri Lanka. And these children were about 15, 16, 17-year-olds. And we were in a rescue home. These children were belonging to the militant group. They were rescued by the Jesuits and they were housed in a different place. So I went to train them and they said, why don't you come and help with us? So I was invited for a 2-day training. Now, these children, if you throw a ball and ask them to go and catch, they will catch it and throw it straight back to you. And you ask them to play catching game or tag game, they would do it very seriously. And you ask them to stand up, they would stand up like that. Go shot like that. Now, there was a 15-year-old girl who was in this team, in this group. And this 15-year-old was, every time I spoke to her, when I asked her to do a task, she would stand erect and take orders and give orders. Now, that is not very normal behavior because she was trained like that. And every time you ask her to do something, she would do it the same way. And because of this, we know that she has been trained in a particular way. And if she did not do that, she would be punished by her seniors. And she continuously thought that her seniors were around and she would be punished. Now, also, people have these recurrent dreams, same dream coming back again and again, or the same event being played back. Now, as you know, this can be a random dream, okay? And then we have what is known as dissociation. What is dissociation? Dissociation is you don't relate to the event. For example, when there's a funeral, you're laughing. When there is something really happy going on, you are crying. And then whole point is you are still thinking about that and reconnecting to that event again and again and again. The next is also looking at intense or prolonged psychological distress when something or part of the event is resembling it. I told you about triggers. Last time we saw about triggers. A trigger, something that a ball that is coming and hitting you hard is reminding you of something else. The smell of coffee, it reminds you of something else. I remember a woman who came to visit me in my office. And the moment she came into my office, she started shaking. And she was very uncomfortable. And this woman was an acid attack victim. And my office happens to be just above the chemistry lab. And chemistry lab, you come up with all kinds of smells. Sometimes you have a very nice smell that's very appetizing. Sometimes you have these obnoxious smells coming up. Sometimes you have smells that you don't want to even be close to. And that day, she smelled acid. The acid that was used to attack her. And the whole time she was sitting with me, she could not concentrate. I had to take her out very far away. We had to walk about 1 kilometer with her, and then we continued the conversation. Then we're also looking at physiological reactions. And this could be a loss of a tiny part of your finger, a scar on the face, anything else, just anything, which reminds you of the event. So this is where we are talking about symbols as well. Now, this is one part. The next part is this where we are talking about a lot more. You persistently avoid stimuli associated with the events afterward. And this avoidance takes the form of one of the following. Now, we are really wanting to get rid of these memories and thoughts about the event, avoiding it, avoiding the place, avoiding the person, avoiding the situation, avoiding whatever. Avoiding or trying to avoid external reminders that lead to distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings. It's very interesting because most of the times we don't want to go there. I don't want to go to that street. I don't want to go to that area. I don't want to go in the darkness. It's just trying to distressing memories. It's just overflowing and crowding. Meeting that person, for example. A student would never go, a student would never go to a particular teacher and meet with him. Would never. I mean, never meaning just never. And the student was constantly absent in the class. Now, why was the student absent in the class? Because the student once, just once, met with this faculty member, and the faculty member spoke in such a degrading term that he would never want to go to this person again. He was traumatized because the same degrading terms were used by his father at home when the father was alive and was an abuser. Now, the person is trying to avoid all the time. And he's having these memories of the father that was triggered by this teacher. So we had to sit with the student, talk to her, and then slowly take things out. Also trying to avoid these external reminders. And these reminders are triggers again. They can come anywhere. They can happen to anybody. And it could just be very, very small, tiny things. A person who sees a knife, for example, avoid using a knife. How can you avoid using a knife? It's very difficult to avoid using a knife. And the knife was used as a symbol or a weapon of threat. And therefore, that's something that continues to happen. So we're trying to look at these symptoms where we are talking about it's one or many or both, anytime we are looking at it. That takes us to the next very important part. Now, this is a new category that looks at kind of repetitive alterations in the understanding of moods, emotions associated with the event that begin or got worse after the events occurred. You experience one or you experience two or more of the following symptoms. Now, this, please remember, if it is just one, nothing is wrong with you. Two, maybe. But more than two, it's a little bit, you can diagnose it a little more accurately. The inability to remember important aspects of an event due to dissociative amnesia. This is also known as a fugue state. There's something called fugue. A friend of mine, a few years ago, met with a very serious accident. And the accident happened about 200 kilometers away from Chennai. So I took a car and rushed to see him. And everybody thought his neck was broken and they had given up on him. But I really begged the bystanders over there who called me and said, please take him to a hospital. I made arrangements in one of the best hospitals there. They took him and they took care of the guy. And then I asked him, just that night, I spoke to you. You were with your wife. And this was at 10 o'clock. And next day morning, 9 o'clock, you're 200 kilometers away. What happened? And he was found somewhere very far. 200 kilometers in a night on a motorbike is not something which you would do. And so I asked him what happened. Repeatedly, we kept asking him. He just couldn't recollect a single thing. He just couldn't. And this inability to recollect is dissociative amnesia. And this is kind of not just forgetting. There's something called selective forgetting. No, you don't want to remember that, so you want to forget that. That's different. You just can't remember anything. Then again, we're talking about exaggerated beliefs, negative beliefs or expectations about yourself and others in the world. It's persistent. It's always there, and you're always thinking that people are bad. And you're also thinking about people and the expectations and stuff like that. You are becoming a very negative person. Now, if you have read this Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale, it's very Christian. The book is very Christian, but it's very helpful for people who are kind of going in circles with negative thoughts. The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale is a very interesting book. Highly recommend it for people who are going through these negative vibrations. And that book gives you such a positive feel and talks about the only negative person in the world is you, because you are the one who's reflecting this negativity. It also talks about the need and importance of positive psychology. This whole school of positive psychology, many of you would have understood this, seen this. Not all of it is completely scientific and proven methods. Positive psychology can come up with some very nonsensical things also. But there is a lot of evidence that talks about the positiveness. But then you are living in a very negative world because everybody who's around you is negative. You tend to blame yourself, and you come and it's kind of sinking. You're in a sinking ship and the water has gone above your head. You can't keep your head held high. You can't breathe and you're sinking and you're saying, I am the cause of everything. Now, please remember that you are not the cause of every bad thing that's happening in the world. If you've met some people like that, please tell them that they are not the cause that the world exists. Tell them that there are good things happening in the world despite of you being like this in a miserable state. But sometimes we go into a self-blame. And then there's also constantly we're talking about emotional states of fear, horror, anger, guilt, and shame. This goes on. You're scared for everything. You're horrified and you're petrified. There's so much anger, you want to break things down and hit people, and there's so much of guilt. And you're ashamed of yourself. Now, constantly, if you're in fear or horror or anger or guilt or shame, what happens to you is you get tuned to that. Because you're tuned to that, you are no longer sensible. You're only sensitive. Now, sensitivity without sensibility is very dangerous. Everything hurts. Everybody is bad. You're scared of everything. And very typical reaction. There's a very interesting Tamil film that talks about this. It's called Tenali. If you guys can get a translated version of the film, it's a beautiful film. The first part of it is about trauma, about this young man who comes to India as a refugee, and he's so traumatized and he's so scared of everything. And he's just so scared of everything. And it's a comedy, of course, but then the first part is very, very nice. The next is also looking at feelings of detachment, alienation, and estrangement from others. The feelings of detachment is you no longer want to invest in any relationships. And you feel that you are completely standing there, out there. You don't want to interact with people and all that. And then, self-alienation is a very serious problem. What is this alienation? Alienation is you are distancing yourself from others. You're cocooning yourself. You're putting yourself in a cocoon and you want to go and stay in an island like Tom Hanks in Castaway. Okay, that just by chance happened. But that's what you want to do. You want to alienate yourself. Okay, stay away from everybody. And then that's what leads to estrangement also. And these estrangements are also very difficult. Now, you don't have the capacity to be happy. You don't have the capacity to be satisfied. You don't have the capacity to be content. Now that is quite serious, because most of the time when you're thinking of being content and not being satisfied, you are trying to hit against a blank wall because you're not happy. And these are areas that you typically need to understand in the larger context. So the last one is your arousal and reactivity symptoms that are associated with events include two or more of the following. There is this irritable behavior, angry outbursts. There's just no provocation at all. And boom, 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 boom. You see, you walk into your house, everything is in order, and you just see the tablecloth that is adjusted a little bit this side or that side, and you throw a fit, saying that you can't even arrange a small tablecloth, blah, 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 blah. And then that leads to serious violence. And you take an object and you smash it on the floor and you break it. And that's part of acting in and acting out, which we uh, be will be dealing with tomorrow. Also looking at this entire reckless or self-destructive behavior. It can be, this is also known as negative coping. It can be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be excessive watching movies, excessive masturbation, and excessive things like this continue to happen. Then a very clear sign and symptom of hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is you think that this event is going to happen again and you don't go to sleep. Like 2 months after tsunami. Tsunami happened in 2004. 3 months later, in the month of March 2005, I went to a few villages that were severely affected by tsunami. And I looked at the young men who were not sleeping. I asked them, when was the time you slept? They said, you mean in the bed or at home? Yeah, just in the bed at home. They said it was 2.5, 3 months ago. I asked them what happened. We think the sea will come back to us again. So we are waiting on the seashore, on the beach, smoking this tiny beedi. It's like a cigarette. And sitting and watching the ocean, thinking that it's going to come back and take us again. It had not happened for the last 2 months. It's not going to happen now. So I asked them another question. So what will you do when it happens? He said, we will run. And why do you think it's going to happen again? They said it came 3 times and we believe that it's going to take us some more time before it comes again. But then if it comes suddenly, we want to be alert. So this hypervigilance is really interesting. And next is the exaggerated response, startling. Whoa, surprise. For everything you get startled. That's another area. And very, very serious issues with concentration. You just can't concentrate. You're very distracted. One of the ways we find this out is we tell them a story, a 10-line story, and we ask people to repeat that story. And they just can't. Impossible. So we were using playback theater. Post-tsunami and post-conflict, we were using playback theater in different places. Playback theater is a technique where the story is actually narrated by the audience. So we called one of the guys and asked him to tell the story. He could not tell 5 sentences straight. He's going all over the place. Despite the fact there's somebody who's guiding them, he's going all over the place. Impossible to work on. And then they're also talking about difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, having restless sleep. Sleep is a great indicator because what happens in your sleep is your brain just settles down. It continues to work, it settles down. You're not generating fresh thoughts. And there's more oxygen being flown up and down, up and down. This is just not possible due to various reasons. So these are, you need to look at, include 2 or more of the following. Now these are just basic symptoms. So if people have these symptoms, I'm going to share the slides immediately after this session, so you will have them with you. And you have these things, even normal people have these reactions. You need not be traumatized. Don't think you're traumatized just because you have 1 or 2 of these. You need to have everything together. And for that, you need to remember these. Sometimes you don't have to remember it. You just have to look up or refer these notes, but still you will need to look at these at some point of time, or just remember a few things. Now, please remember that if you're not trained and qualified, So diagnose, don't diagnose. There's only a trigger, there's only a tip of the iceberg. So don't go around diagnosing everybody, saying that you're traumatized, he's traumatized, I'm traumatized. No, that's we are mature enough not to do that. Okay. Now I'm going to just pause for a minute to take some questions. If there are questions, let me pause to take a few questions before we move into groups. Barbara says, so basically everyone is traumatized for one reason or the other, except for Matthew Richard. Now, the whole point is no, we are not traumatized for some reason or the other. When traumatization is different, trauma as such is quite different from having any kind of reaction. People who have seen the worst of things in life need not be traumatized. Some people who have seen nothing at all, very small things, can be traumatized. Now, again, trauma is, when you're talking about trauma, when you're talking about traumatic events, it's the exposure to the event. It's the exposure. And then each individual reacts differently. It's hard to tell unless you make these diagnostics and develop a checklist and then go through with them. But communities can be diagnosed with trauma also, depending on the incident. For example, post Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, between 1977 and 79, hundreds of people were massacred. All right. And there were children who were killed, and everything happened so soon. It was almost like a Holocaust that took place. And when you meet people who have lived through that generation, tell us these horrible stories and how they coped with these things. And they also tell us how bad or good they felt about the entire situation. And then mostly they also tell us how they were never exposed to any of these atrocities, but still were traumatized. And there is a generation who's now in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who lived through that, constantly lived through those experiences. So that's something which is really interesting to see. Amanda has said, if a person gives reaction too much to particular things, can we say it's trauma? No, you can't say it is trauma. It could just be instant reactions. The conditions are very important. Please remember the diagnosis is very different. So we are going through basically combination of many things. It needs to be a combination. It's like COVID. Trauma is like COVID. You just have a throat pain that need not be COVID. Okay? Throat pain with body pain may be COVID. Throat pain with body pain plus fever, 60% COVID. You can more or less say. Throat pain, body pain, irritable bowels, and then plus, difficulty in breathing, Achanda, COVID, definitely COVID. Go for test. Loss of smell, definitely COVID. Just loss of smell without anything. No, it cannot be COVID. Yes, go ahead.
So just a comment with a question that becomes a reflection. I don't know. So every definition is a political definition. So if you say that conditions are essential, who sets that threshold? This is, to me, it's also fictional. And for those that impinge the violence, must say, no, it must be really terrible violence for you to be traumatized by it. And if you think of structural violence, it's still constraining people in a way. So I'm thinking, how will these definitions adapt and adjust and modernize? If we think of COVID and people being socially distant and isolated, we're already talking about trauma due to COVID because it's a self-isolation that's like a confinement and the social disconnect. And so I wonder, the reason I'm talking about this is very concrete is because right now in the US setting, which is the one I support, people discussing race and all that, the left, political left, have made all kinds of things politically incorrect. So you have conversations and people say they're triggered and you cannot talk about those things and that they're being re-traumatized. So what I'm saying is how much of these definitions are empowering and how much they are disempowering, and who sets the boundaries of what is trauma and what isn't trauma? And those are my inquiries. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting observations. Very interesting. Now, what is trauma? What is not trauma? What is the threshold? Interestingly, that's why we spoke so much about culture. Okay, there is no universal definition. Everything keeps changing, it's very dynamic. Experiences are dynamic, individuals are dynamic. That's why we go with the combinations. There's no one single threshold. Okay, what is violence? A slap is a violence. A tight slap is a violence. Is violence, right? The other violence is not giving you food just because you're black or you're white. Is violence. So violence always need not be just physical violence, different types of violence, but the way people experience it. People experience it, and you move to see the event. Is the event traumatizing? If the event is traumatizing, then you will have PTSD. If the event has traumatized you, not all events traumatize everybody. Like we have come, Florina and I have survived a number of times. We've been this close to being killed, this close. I mean, we've survived bomb blasts and we've come out successfully with it. It's just a few minutes, a few seconds later, if we had gone there, we would have been killed. Few seconds, literally seconds. And there are people who have been just, who had a door slam on their face, being traumatized. So there's no real threshold. It's individual. So remember, every individual is unique, and the capacity to experience pain and grief is very unique as well. The capacity to experience it and the capacity to come out also is very different. Now, thanks, Anando, for that beautiful comment. We're talking about, you are looking at that very interesting book by Judith Herman. It's nice. And I highly recommend it for an intimate reading of the book. Please read that book. It's very, very good. Now, we're also talking about a constantly an interaction or a dilemma that we face between trauma and others. Now, culturally, some of these traumas have become acceptable. It's okay to be traumatized. Don't deal with it. Don't talk about it. It's okay. We know you're traumatized. It's okay. But then that's not a way to deal with it. Sometimes you must deal with it, right? Sometimes you don't have to deal with it. It'll go away by itself. It's like a common cold. You go to the doctor, it takes 7 days to go away. You don't go to the doctor, it takes a week to heal. So it's like that sometimes. The body has some of these natural coping mechanisms. And these natural coping mechanisms can be spread in many ways. It's not just one time, but in a number of times we can look at these natural coping mechanisms, which we will be dealing with in the next session on self-care and healing and all that. We'll be talking about that. Do you guys, go ahead, Rabat.
Oh, hey, Ashok. So I see you might, be ready to maybe switch us into groups or something, but
No, it's okay. I was just going to ask you a question because I have a lot more to cover. Do you want me to go through this and go into groups tomorrow, or do we have to, if we can continue with questions, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
Go ahead with the question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to the conversation on, because we're touching on PTSD, and it happened that I was listening to something yesterday where I think it just to maybe add to the conversation that we're having, where the avoidance and numbing behaviors. Like the person talked about avoidance and numbing behaviors, and he talked first about these are very natural behaviors that we have. So these are not. So we do avoid stuff because of uncomfortable. We do maybe want to not feel things, and that's fine. And he said the issue, what happens is that, like you said, what happened, what the event was, and I liked your comment on the trauma timeline and those questions. So he said we respond to something happens, and at the time it's like a survival, like you said, like it's a survival, like I'm trying to find my safety, or I don't have a choice, and And what happens is that the difference between the normal avoidance behavior and is that what happens is that the trauma latches onto this sort of thing. And so we start to be, it's convincing us to continue to live our lives with the coping mechanism as a norm. And so that's where a lot of the other things tend to manifest. And I just thought I'll throw that out there to all of us just because it's, yeah, I like that there's people with the psychological backgrounds here as well. But I thought that was interesting because I think you're talking about this sort of thing. It's repetitive. There's a certain set of things that can be noticed, and they are impacting life in the present because the decision to use that coping mechanism or the constellation of mechanisms is running a campaign on our heads or in the person's head. It's running the campaign that this is the only way you'll kind of not feel that again. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of like example.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely input. I was also going to tell you about the numbing effect. The numbing effect of trauma is that you no longer experience pain anymore. Like women who have undergone FGMs, you know, it's a very serious kind of an issue that's going on. And like sex is for pleasure, sex is for procreation, and sex is for so many other things. Now, the numbing effect is seen and studies done with women who have undergone these FGMs have constantly experienced this numbing effect, or rape victims who have been studied again and again and again have this numbing effect. They no longer want to experience anything to do with sex or pleasure related to that. They no longer want to be part of it. I remember one time I was interviewing a young woman, and this was just post-violence that had taken place in Odisha, a communal violence where a woman was brutally violated and all that. And for her, life was absolutely emotionless, absolutely emotionless. Very straight face, no emotion, no joy, no laughing, no crying, nothing. And she was clearly traumatized. And I was making a film, and that's when I happened to meet her. I was meeting the victims, and I was, of course, in confidence filming them and with a lot of precaution. Now, with this case, what do you do? And in the other cases, people are not aware of what has happened to them. They're not traumatized. They don't relate to a trauma based on this, but the event is so intense that everybody around is traumatized. For example, I was telling you the story of what happened last week. These two children who were severely abused by this old guy. The children were made to narrate the story in front of the counselor and the police. A woman who was just listening to this horrible story fainted. She was just listening to the story, fainted. And she was not even connected to this incident. She's not connected to these children. She was not connected to anything. She happened to be there. Just happened to be there. But the police and these other guys were so insensitive to have an inquiry in almost in public view. Now, what is happening over here? The children are narrating the story without any feeling. Just saying, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, just saying what happened. But the feeling with which they're supposed to narrate this is missing because they don't know anything else. They're 5-year-olds. They're 7-year-old. Imagine the life they're going to have after this. And these things are, when the story was narrated to me by a third person who was listening to that story, I could not take it anymore. I said, please stop, enough. I don't want any more graphics. I don't want any more graphics. Stop. You just write it if you want to write it, or just say XYZ happened. Because for me, even after seeing so many cases, those horrible tales, and those children's picture just keeps flashing in my mind again and again and again. And a 5-year-old black girl. She looks very dark. And that's how those children are. And a 7-year-old child. And they're babies. But when they're narrating this incident, a complete detachment, dissociation from the experience. But nevertheless, coming back to the question of experiencing these things, you don't know that this is a trauma until somebody tells you that it's a trauma. Until somebody tells you this is trauma, man, come on, you can deal with it. There are ways to deal with it. That is the situation in most of the developing world. In another case, when we saw a brother and sister, the brother has not been speaking to the sister for a long time. For about 3 years, they've not spoken. The brother picks up the phone and calls the sister and tells the sister, Akka means older sister, Akka, I'm being admitted to the hospital. I'm not well. And the sister panics and says, why are you calling me now? No, because I'm going to the hospital, I'm not well. Which hospital? I don't know. Where are you going? I don't know. And he keeps the phone. I happen to know both the brother and sister. And she informed me saying that my brother is being taken to the hospital. Can you check this out? I spoke to him, and the moment they loaded him to an ambulance, they put the oxygen mask. And the oxygen mask, they took him to the hospital. And in the hospital at 9:30, he calls me. Normally, nobody calls me at 9:30 because they know that I'm also very exhausted and I don't answer too many calls at that point. He calls me and he asks for my advice. And I tell him what to do, and he's got COVID and XYZ. And the next day morning, he died. The sister, who is healthy, who's all right, she's not having any problems, she calls me to find out what happened to her brother. Because she's not able to reach her brother, nobody's speaking the phone. She calls me and asks me what happened. And that night, I knew from the hospital, because the hospital authorities looked at the phone and they looked at who he had spoken to, and my number was there, and they called me. And they gave me this news. They said so and so passed away. Now, for 2 years, they were not talking because of a traumatic event, and it broke that ice. He calls and then he dies. And I was the last person who he spoke to. And the sister comes home. She comes to meet me. She hugs me and cries and cries and cries. And every time I say brother, the word brother, she goes back to that incident. For 2 years, 3 years, they have not spoken, they've not met each other. Now, this is the futility. And that event really traumatized and shook her. Not what happened earlier. That one phone call actually traumatized her. The phone call saying that, hey, I'm being taken to a hospital, I'm not well. So then I sat with her for many days. I would sit with her and talk to her and say, Akka, this is reconciliation. Your brother wanted to reconcile with you before he died. Be happy about it. And he told me, Tessie is the name of the sister. Tessie is maybe worried. Please tell Tessie, I'm all right. Now, reconciliation can take place anywhere. But that phone call, every time, after that, she refused to use a phone for a few weeks. She couldn't use the phone. It was reminding her of that brother's memories. And the family was so distorted. The whole family is distorted. The son wouldn't come for the funeral. The wife was divorced. And one son was trying to handle things from another city. And COVID, you couldn't give him a decent burial. And that's all adding up to it, right? Now, so the experience of trauma can be, and this person is a counselor herself. And she is a drama therapist. And she is capable of doing so many other things. But it just broke her. So that's what trauma can be. It can actually break you very easily. An event can break you very easily. All right. So that's kind of thing. Yeah, it's a sad story, but the end of the story is happy because the reconciliation did take place. The last moment did take place. And there are a number of things like this, number of things. So that brings us to the end of today. And tomorrow when we come, I'm going to give you one more task. I want you to bring a symbol tomorrow. A symbol, any symbol. A symbol of trauma or a symbol of hope. Anything. Just bring a symbol. A symbol of trauma or a symbol of hope. Any symbol. Just bring a symbol.
Or both if you want.
Yeah, or both. Yes. So we'll start. I'm sorry we couldn't have a discussion today. Tomorrow we'll go into breakout groups. And I promise we'll have some. So now we want to shake a little bit. So what I want you to do is want you to raise your left hand up. Raise your left hand up and show me your fingers. Up and show me your fingers. And shake your fingers. And bring it close to the camera. Okay. Shake it, shake it, shake it, shake it. Close to it. And now take it back. Raise it up and down. Now do it to the right hand. Raise your right hand up and shake it and bring it close to the camera. Shake it up. Come on. Eman, you can do much better than that. Come on, come on, come on. Yeah, that's good. Back, up and down. Now both your hands up. Both your hands, both your hands. Shake it up, shake it up, shake it up. Like this, like this, like this. Shake it up, shake it up. Keep shaking it up. This is your own butterfly. Butterfly, yeah, come on. Let the butterflies flutter. Let them come to the camera. Ah, that looks beautiful. Look at that, look at that butterflies. Look at those butterflies. Let them fly, let them fly, let them fly, let them fly. And take them back, take them back, take them back. And it's gone. Thank you, people, with those fluttering memories.